Tonight, we're going to begin looking at this vision of what happens to the prostitute or harlot, depending on the translation that you're reading from, and the beast. And we're winding things up. We're getting closer to this vision of the final judgment. But what we begin to see here is that there is, again, going back to understand what is going on spiritually speaking behind all the different things that are going on in the world. Understand where a lot of the persecution is coming from against the church. In a previous vision, John had seen two fantastic beasts, hadn't he? He saw one that came out of the sea, one that came out of the ground. And we're going to see that one of the beasts that's in this particular vision looks pretty much just like that beast that we already saw that represented the nations of the world that are led by the influence of the dragon or by Satan, those demonic forces. In Revelation chapter 15 and 16, last week, we looked at how God used those seven angels to pour out His judgment, those bowls of wrath, and we again saw the plagues being poured out specifically on those who were persecuting the church, those who were trying to belittle the Word of God, and we left them off cursing God for bringing the judgments. You know, each judgment you'd have thought they'd have repented, but they didn't. Instead, they became that much more hard-hearted toward God and the things of God. Now, before we reach the climax in Revelation, where we're looking forward to getting to in 21 and 22, we begin to see this picture of the eternal kingdom of God. We have to go through a couple more sets of judgment. And so that's where we pick up tonight. And one of the things that we see in this particular vision is we see a new symbolic influencer. When we had two beasts, the second beast was the false prophet. The ones that were speaking, trying to convince the people to listen to the king, to listen to the dragon, to worship that false image versus worshiping God. And in this particular one, we see a picture of a woman with the beast. So let's look at Revelation 17, verses 1 through 6. And here we get the opening picture as a whole that John has revealed to him. Revelation 17 verse 1 says, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk.' And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly." And so John keeps getting taken from one scene to another scene to another scene. And so notice this particular time, again, he's not being translated somewhere literally. It says that, again, the angel of the Lord calls out to John and says, "I need to show you another vision." And he's taken specifically into a wilderness, it says. Now, one of the things that we have to remember is we've seen this kind of image in the past. When we first started these visions of what was going to happen in the future, what has happened in the past, spiritually speaking, we saw a woman, a child, and the dragon for the first time. And if you remember in that particular vision, we see a contrast to this particular woman. And that last vision, it showed the woman that was chaste, the woman that brought into the world this child. It was the church, those who had been responsible that God used to bring Christ into the world. But when we saw that the dragon tried to attack her, God led her into a wilderness. He protected her. He took care of her. But then as we keep on going, now that we get to this vision, we see the exact opposite. We see the contrast to what the church is supposed to be. If the church is that perfect bride of Christ, then this woman represents everything that is opposed to that way of life. And John is carried into a wilderness, just as that woman had been carried into a wilderness. But then we have to ask the question that was probably on John's mind, well, why is this woman called a prostitute? You know, how did he recognize that she was a prostitute versus any other type of a woman? Well, symbolically speaking, she represents everything that allures, tempts, seduces, and draws people away from God. And that's why it gives us the description, and we're going to see further description throughout chapter 17 and 18, that it says she caused people to be drawn away from God, away from God's way of life. She seduced people to come drink with her and to lay with her, symbolically speaking. She's given the name of an ancient city that is Babylon the Great. When we get into studying the book of Daniel, we're going to see the type of people who were influencing the king of Babylon. We'll understand the type of worship that they had. But the point is, those that lived in ancient Babylon worshipped idols. And every time we see this idolatry in different nations, there's that comparison to that spiritual unfaithfulness. Well, when you think about this, it wasn't any different in John's day. The Roman Empire was known for just its illicit sexual affairs, the way that they used this in worshiping their false gods. When they would go to the temple, they were both the male and female temple prostitutes. And this was part of how they worshiped those false gods. So this is something that he understood the context behind the vision. The Expositor's Bible Commentary says this. It says, Babylon is found wherever there is satanic deception. It is defined more by dominant idolatries than graphic and temporal boundaries. The ancient Babylon is better understood as the archetype head of all the entrenched world resistance to God. Babylon is a trans-historical reality, including idolatrous kingdoms as diverse as Sodom, Gomorrah, Egypt, Babylon, Tyre, Nineveh, and Rome. It may be said that Babylon represents the total culture of the world apart from God, while the divine system is depicted in the New Jerusalem, or the church. Rome is simply one manifestation of that total system. In John's day, Rome was the ruling empire. In John's day, Rome was the one that influenced all the different people and the kings as they absorbed more and more nations into the empire and more people. And they allowed them many times to continue to worship their false gods and just mixed it all together in one big polytheistic religion, if you will. So when we think about that, she's representing that which is trying to seduce people to a different way of life, an alternate way of life, as people today like to call it. But why is Babylon the Great described as a prostitute? Again, this goes back to the Old Testament. All throughout the prophets, we see that when there was these great cities, these great nations that worshiped false gods, they were identified as committing that spiritual idolatry. And so I think I have most of these passages probably in the outline there. Nineveh was described as a harlot city in Nahum 3. The city of Tyre was described this way in Isaiah 23. Historical Babylon was described this way in Jeremiah 51. And even Israel itself, the city of Jerusalem, is described this way. You think about the book of Hosea. One of the hard things about reading the book of Hosea is to see how God used his life and his marriage as an object lesson because she kept leaving him and committed herself in these kind of ways to other people and said, this is what my people are doing to me. My people are leaving me. They're having these illicit affairs by worshiping false gods. And so we see even God's own people at times were allured away from worshiping God according to his law, according to his statutes. And so that's why we see this. But there's something else that we need to understand. One of the Roman historians and philosophers wrote this about prostitutes in Rome. Seneca wrote that the prostitutes of ancient Rome had their name written on a sash that went across their forehead that identified them by their profession. When we read through this description of the woman, it gave us a lot of different descriptions, where she was sitting, how she was sitting, how she was dressed. She was dressed to the nines. I mean, she had pearls and jewels. She's got the clothing that's the color of royalty, but yet across her name, across her forehead was this name, Babylon the Great. Across her forehead is written this mother of all prostitutes and abominations. And so we have that image again of the forehead, not literally, but we see in ancient times that was how a prostitute dressed. She dressed in a way that drew people in, but she also had to wear that name on her forehead that identified her so people would know who she is. And so this, again, we see that imagery in the fact that she has that particular name in verse 5 written on her forehead. Well, in Revelation 17, the prostitute has influence over the kings of the world. When you think about all the different kingdoms, we see a lot of fooling around and a lot of bad things happening from the top down, don't we? It's something we see in nation after nation throughout history. And so when those kings, those rulers, those authorities are first influenced to do things that are more concerned about luxury, concerned about power, wealth, and even the sexual immorality that's described throughout this section, we see that their influence then impacts those that are under them, which impacts all segments of society, doesn't it? One of the things that I still remember is going back to Bill Clinton. Not to get into all that, but one of the things that began to change people's minds about certain things was the affair that he had with Monica Lewinsky. And all of a sudden, well, what is sex? That's a discussion for something else, but it was that idea, he kept, I did not have with that woman. Well, okay, you didn't have that, but you had other things, and it began to change the perception of a lot of young people that I knew of what is okay and what is not okay. And it started from that king down, if you will. And so we see that this is why it talks about how this influences on the kings of the nations. And as the kings of nations are influenced, that influences how they rule their kingdoms and what is acceptable within their kingdoms. All right, so then the last thing, we're not going to talk about it a lot right here. We're going to get into it in just a minute. But then we see that she's riding that beast. And if you notice, everything about the description of beast is that beast that came out of the water in the previous vision. Right on down from the 7 heads, the one that seems like it's dead, but it's not. And we see all these different things. And so John had a question. I'm glad John had a lot of questions. Because if you've noticed something in the book of Revelation, every time John has a question, he doesn't always understand what he's seeing either. He either asks or someone comes alongside of him and says, hey, do you understand? Let me tell you what you're supposed to get out of this. And so that's what we see in verse 7 and 8. John needed an understanding. He sees this woman, he sees the beast, but he just didn't understand what he was supposed to take away from it. So look at verse 7. We get the first description of the beast. It says, but the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was, and is not, and is to come. So John's kind of scratching his head, and all of a sudden we see this. You don't get it, do you? Well, why don't you get it? Well, let me tell you what it is. Let me explain what's going on. And so he begins the illustration here, and the angel says, I want you to understand what you're seeing. And so the beast that you saw isn't going to be quite so confusing. Yes, it has 7 heads, it has 10 horns, it carries her from place to place. But I want you to recognize something. Just like the beast in the past represented different kingdoms that God has allowed to be raised up, or God has raised up to use as a tool for some reason or another, he says those same nations that you've come to understand in the other visions, this beast represents those nations again. And where the nation existed to do things for God's people, against God's people, and then it passed away, that is, it was not, it came back in a new iteration, didn't it? Every time we see a superpower come, and throughout this time, and then it implodes on itself, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then another power rises up. All throughout the Old Testament, we see how God raised up one nation, one superpower, if you will, after another, to be able to, at times, bless God's people, but also to correct God's people when they were lured away from worshiping God the way they should. So he starts out and he says, I want you to understand something about this beast. Just like back in Revelation 13, verse 3, we read, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled, and they followed the beast. A lot of times when we see one nation falter and another come up, there may be some hesitation and there may be some hemming and hawing about giving in to the authority of that new superpower. But over time, people fall in line, don't they? And so he says, don't be surprised when one nation falls and another rises up and people marvel at it, and the next thing you know, they're going along with whatever that particular nation, that superpower, if you will, is going to tell you that they should do. I think King Solomon put it best, there's nothing new under the sun. The same things that have been happening throughout history are still happening today in that regard. Well, let's look at the 7 heads, because, it's one thing to know what this beast is. It's another to understand the symbolism here. Verse 9 through 11, the angel continues. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 who have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not and is, the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7. And it goes to destruction. When you look at this, the heads of the beast represent 7 hills, it says. In John's day, Rome was literally called the city of 7 hills, or 7 mountains. It was literally built up on all these different mounds. And so by John's day, when he's writing to the church, he said these things must soon take place. So a lot of the emphasis is what was about to take place against the church, the persecution they were about to face, the hardships that they were going to be tested with. Will we worship the emperors, or will we worship King Jesus? And so when we think about all these things, we see that one iteration, one representation of the beast in these heads is the kingdom of Rome. But notice it says that these are several kingdoms. There's several kings. It doesn't just represent 7 hills that she's sitting on, but it represents 7 kings. It says 5 of those kings have already been, one is, one's yet to come. The point that we see in this is, again, that there's going to be that constant changing. There's that constant appearing of different nations who are going to lead people into false worship, into a false way of life in every regard. But in the book of Daniel, we get a little bit of clarification too. When we see some of these symbols in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, we'll talk about them more then, but Daniel was able to interpret several dreams. He had a vision, and some visions brought to himself directly. But one of the things that we see with all those visions was that they were talking about those kingdoms that had been going to take place from Daniel's time going forward to the time of Christ. And when it talked about those different kingdoms, it was talking about first the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians. It was going to include the Greco-Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great. When he died, that kingdom was split into 2 because his people couldn't agree who should have power, so they split the kingdom up. And then the Romans came to power. And so by the time John is living and teaching, that's everything that has taken place. Just as those visions showed Daniel were going to take place, John gets this vision and it says some of these have already taken place. There's one kingdom that is actively ruling over the people of the world now, and there's another one yet to come. Well, if this wasn't enough, let's go on, because there were 10 horns. It wasn't just 7 heads that represented these different nations. Verses 12 through 14 goes on to say, and the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. For he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So he says all throughout this time, as different kingdoms are trying to draw people away from God, there's going to be that remnant who remain faithful to God, to Jesus Christ. He says that they are the ones who Christ has called out of this world. We're going to get to that in a little bit too. But he says they are those who are called to a different way of life. They are those who are called to live out that faith in the midst of everything that the world is trying to lead them away from in this world. Hendrickson says that these kings are all mighty ones in every realm. One of the things that we see with those kingdoms, they weren't just specific kings that were successive, it was kingdoms that were going to take place. When it talks about these 10 horns that were on the 7 heads, it says they're 10 kings. They haven't yet come to power. In other words, he's telling John, he said, these things are going to start taking place soon, but that doesn't mean we're getting to the end of time yet. Think about how many different kingdoms have risen up since the rise of Rome. You think about, just all the different kingdoms that have risen to different influence and different powers. Just think about just over recent history. Think about the rise of the Soviet Union. The United States, not of America, but of the Socialist Republic. We think about all those nations that formed the Soviet Union, how they were made socialist, and one of the things that did was, well, there's no place for religion because everyone needs to have this utopian idea of life. Everyone needs to have the state dictate what property people get and the kind of jobs and the kind of money and everything else. But that is one of the reasons that the church was suppressed and persecuted under socialism, under communism. We still see this in places like communist China, in North Korea, those places that still have those communist governments. Think about the rise of Germany. There was a time when people thought, man, Germany's going to take over everything. We just can't beat these people. But yet, things began to take place, even within the nation. People began to say this is crazy and tried to take out Hitler, to be able to take out that power source and leave a vacuum from within, as the Allies were trying to push them back themselves. But we see nation after nation that rise up, and part of what they do as they rise up is they begin persecuting the church. One of the things that we see historically that Hitler did was to convince people that the Jews were a problem, that they were all of their problems. And those Christians that stood up to support them, and those Christians that refused to give in to a lot of the different ideologies of the Nazi Party, they too were put to death and sent to camps. So we see a lot of different things. Every time these powers rise, they may seem okay at first, they may seem to offer something great and people come on board, but we see that with every time the power does that, over time the church begins to be persecuted. And it makes us ask a real question, or at least it does for me. Is America next? I love America. I've always said that. I want great things for America. But there's a whole lot of things that have started taking place over the last several months, if not years, that have really begun chipping away at even religious freedom. And we see that with all these different influences that are coming in, I'm going to purposely stay off of that because I could probably go the rest of the night talking about different things. But the point is, we see that nation after nation that God allows to rise for the benefit of others at times decides, hey, we want to do things our way. We want to be influenced by other things outside of God's word and God's blessing. And when that happens, life begins to get even harder for the church. And it's happened all throughout history. He says, you know what? Those 10 horns, they represent kings that have not yet come to power, but they're not going to be any different than the rest because they all give their authority and their power back to the influence of the beast. So they may be parts of the beast, they may be a head, they may be a horn on the head, but it's the idea that they're still connected back to that demonic influence. And we're going to see that even more in a minute. All right, so he says these 10 horns, they represent 10 kings that have not yet been raised up to power, but when they do, they are going to stand against the Lamb and those who are faithful to the Lamb. And he says they're going to reign symbolically for an hour apiece. It's this idea that they're going to be raised up, but their empire is going to be short-lived. Their authority is going to be short-lived before someone else comes to power. Well, there was another thing that we saw in that vision, and it said at first that the woman was sitting on the waters. Well, what waters are these? It describes it in verse 15. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. In other words, she's not just trying to influence the governing leaders as a whole. She says, in the opening of the vision, we see that the idea that all the different kings are being influenced. They're drawn in to drink with her, to sleep with her. But it says, but she's also going to begin influencing all the people of the world. And that's what we see in this, isn't it? It says peoples, multitudes, nations, languages. It's that idea of it's going to affect every corner of society throughout the world in one way or another. It has already, hasn't it? You look at those influences all throughout the world. There are those influences for Christ still, but we also see more times than not, we're seeing those things that influence people away from the truth of God, away from that true way of worship of the one true God. And so it says that the water she's sitting on, it's this idea of the influence she has on people all throughout mankind. We saw that with this scroll. Again, I just want to keep linking these things together, see how they're building. When we looked at the scroll that had the 7 seals, when that 6th seal was broken, we saw how it impacted all the different types of people. It said from the kings to the princes, the generals, the rich, the powerful, the freedmen, and the slave. Again, with this woman sitting on the waters, it says it represents all the people. It represents the kings, but it also represents the peoples, the multitudes, the nations, and the languages. Well, the woman eventually is going to be judged. Thank God. All right, so we see all the way that she is influencing the kingdoms and the people of the world. Verse 16 through 18 says, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw in the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. So she's had authority. She thinks she's a queen. We're going to see that she says she's a queen as we get into this judgment in the next chapter. But at this point, the angel's still trying to describe everything that John is seeing and explaining it to him, and says, you know what? There's coming a time when people are going to get tired of sin. There are times when people revolt because they're tired of being lied to. They're tired of people trying to influence them to do things and to think the way they want them to think, when they know that there is truth that can be found and that they want the truth and they want to do what is true and what is right. And it says there comes a point where sin leaves us empty and people turn and say, I've had enough. And so we see a description here. It says even with these different nations, it says that, you know what, they're going to have enough and they're going to turn on that influence. And they're going to be doing something about it. Even though they may not turn to God, it says God can still use that as a tool to judge those nations that are continuing to stand against God's truth and putting his people under their boot, if you will. And so notice it's very graphic, isn't it? It says they're going to turn, they're going to devour, they're going to eat her flesh, they're going to burn her up. I mean, it's this idea of total judgment. And so it says there's coming a time when even those who have been willing to go along with whatever the party line is, if you will, they're going to get tired of it too. And they're going to rise up. And when that happens, we see it says God's involved in it. God sometimes acts by permissive will. Sometimes he acts by direct will. He says in this case, he has allowed these different nations to have power for a time, but he is going to lead their thoughts to be one and to come against her. Think about Pharaoh for a second. We're not going to stay there for a minute, but think about Pharaoh when the Israelites were in Egypt, and at first, every time Moses told him, "Let my people go," he chose to harden his heart, didn't he? But you get further into the plagues, and it says, "And God hardened his heart," that he wouldn't let him go, so that God would bring about that next judgment, until his heart was softened. And he said, "All right, pray and get this out of here, and we'll let him go." But we see there's a way that God works through people's decisions, but then when we continually stand against him, he says, "Okay, you refuse to repent, you refuse to do what is right," and there are times when he directs their hearts to become hardened in one way or another. So that's why it says that God has put it into their hearts to carry this out for his purpose of being one in mind, and even handing that royal power back over to the beast again. So he says, but it's that hardening of the heart to accomplish God's purpose, to be able to be able to carry out that judgment in the end. Well, chapter 18 through chapter 19, we're not going to go through it all tonight, but we're going to start into the first little bit. We actually see the fall of Babylon. It's one thing to see her influence on the peoples of the world, but we begin to see that judgment of God fall in Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. Babylon has led the world from God, and so judgment has to fall. It says, "After this I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a voice, a mighty voice, 'Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living.'" So we see all those things that draw men's attention: money, power, wealth, luxury. We see those intimate affairs that are drawn in here. But it says, this woman has had such influence on people as a whole, from the kings down. But we see, where is this authority? What is this woman really all about? It says that she's that place of demonic influence. A haunt is a watchtower, when we're looking at it in this particular term. And so it says, and when you think about Babylon and all that Babylon represented, it said that Babylon is filled with demonic spirits. It says that it's a place, it's a haunt, it's filled with demons. Every unclean spirit, every unclean bird, every unclean, detestable beast. It's this idea that anything that is opposed to the teaching of God is now coming against the people of God. And this is why we see fallen is Babylon the Great. Judgment is following. And it actually gives the appearance of what we see in the Old Testament. Babylon was a real place. It had real authority, and it really did fall. And we see different pictures of this in Jeremiah 50 to 51, Ezekiel 26 to 27. And so just as the real city fell because of its sin, and it fell to another empire, we see that spiritually speaking, he says, other nations are going to fall the same way. As they're just completely influenced by all these demonic, unclean spirits, they're going to fall. What have they led the nation specifically to do? It says, well, they've been drunk on the passion of sexual immorality. Again, this is dealing with idolatry. Yes, there is that real immorality, but when we're talking spiritually speaking, it's that idolatry. Every time we see idolatry in the Old Testament, we see a link to this type of behavior. But really, there's a couple different isms that really characterize the world around us today. There's hedonism. All I do is based on me. It's all me, myself, and I. What makes me feel good, that's what I'm going to do. Commercialism. Give me more and more and more and more and more. And that's why I said the merchants are getting rich. Why? Because people want to get more and more and more and more. And so there's those luxuries that are being afforded. But we also see it's all just that idea of even secularism. We can have life and enjoy life apart from God completely. And that's one of the things that we've seen, especially with the church and the state, haven't we? There's that idea of, well, no. Secular thought has to rule government. You can have your religious thought in the church, but don't try to join the two together. And so we see again that there's that influence there. And he says these influences are far and wide. Well, look at how God calls his people to flee this. And this is what we're going to close with. Revelation 18, verses 4 through 8. Before judgment falls, the angel says, or John says, when I heard another voice, then I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. So with all that she's done throughout the ages to influence people, God's voice comes through mightily and clearly, and he says, if you're one of mine, get away from her influence. Now, the reality is we really can't get away from all influence, can we? One of the things that James 1:4 says is, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. We can be all by ourselves and still be tempted. But he says, as a whole, when we have the opportunity to choose the people we're going to associate with, the people we're going to hang out with on a regular basis, the people that we're going to have as like-minded individuals, he says, who is that? He says, if you're part of the world, if you look like the world, if you talk like the world, if you sound like the world, you just want everything that the world wants, he says, are you really any different than the world? So very specifically, he says, I want my people, if you are faithful to me, if you are part of my kingdom, I want you to remove yourself as much as possible from the influence and the way of thinking of this world. He says there's a reason. He says if we don't remove ourselves from that influence to the best of our ability, he says we're going to start thinking like that and acting like that. And the more we do it, the easier it becomes. And he says if that becomes the case with the church, he says then that church is going to face the same plagues, the same judgment that the beast and all those who follow the beast are going to have. And that's why he says, I want you to come out of this. My people need to take pains in any way we can. Now, some people have tried to take this literally, haven't they? Even today, there are groups and communities of Christians who have just kind of left the city. They've left everything to try and form their own, communes, for lack of a better word to say. I hate to use that word because of some of the ideas that come to mind with that. But, there are different places throughout the world that's exactly what they've done to try and withdraw from those influences, to be able to have more accountability with each other and to live closer to the teaching of God's Word. But even doing that brings its own challenges, doesn't it? It doesn't get rid of the temptations. And so that's why he's saying it's not a literal call to get out of the world, because we can't do that. But it's the idea of what are you going to fill your mind with? What are you going to fill your thoughts with? How are you going to behave day in, day out? Are you going to take your role from God and His Word, or are you going to take your way of thinking from the world around you? The Expositor's Bible Commentary says this. It says, Christians are to separate themselves ideologically and, if necessary, physically from all forms of Babylon. The question that was raised is there enough evidence to convict you of being a Christian? I wish I could take credit for that. That's not mine. But, the question is there enough evidence to convince other people to convict you of being a Christian versus being part of the world? We have to be in the world. Jesus showed us this morning. He said, how are those that are sinners going to be saved if we're not coming into their midst and we're not loving them and we're not teaching them? But at the same time, he says, we can't get so involved that becomes our way of life, and we lose that saltiness. Last thing, God indicates that His judgment is in fact just. He says it's going to fall because of everything that they've done. If you're faithful, he says, then come out of it. He gives us another call of repentance. If you're getting too close, turn back. What were the whole 7 churches, the letters to the churches about? If you've turned, turn back before it's too late. He says, and if you will, then I'll continue to bless you. I'll continue to use you. But he says, but if you won't turn back, I will be just. I will bring judgment, and you will be part of that judgment if you don't turn back to that way of faith before it's too late. And so all throughout it, we see that there's a call to faithfulness to the church, but we also begin to see that judgment is something that's going to happen. It's already happening. It's been happening throughout time. And the question is, how are we going to live going forward? Are we going to let the world influence us, or are we going to influence the world? All right. Well, are there any questions before we close this evening? I know we kind of went through pretty quick a lot of different stuff. All right. Well, if not, how about stand and we'll close with a word of prayer.